Hi, this is Shadi Atia, Assistant Professor of Sustainable Architecture and Building Technology at Liège University in Belgium. Today I'm going to talk about research in architecture. Well, the audience of my presentation is early career researchers who are preparing a research thesis, dissertation or journal publication or a research proposal in the domain of architecture and the built environment. Well, I'm going to talk about 6 main topics: the exact and non-exact sciences, the non-scientific and scientific research, how to join a scientific community, how to follow a scientific methodology or approach, how to define your research outcomes, and how to prepare for that. Well, when we talk about research in architecture, we need to distinguish the difference between exact and non-exact sciences. Historically, architecture evolved in the realm of art, philosophy, and theory. And in this sense, architecture was always mixing between philosophy and art, theory, history. And with the evolution of technology, historically, it started to get more and more developed and going in approach from different point of views. As you can see, when I talk about the built environment, it's about architecture, it's about planning and urbanism, and it's about landscape. Those are the 3 domains that I'm talking about here. And when you can see that they are all related to design, we can find the challenge that architects face when they do research. By default, architects are trained to do design, while in reality design is not research. Even that there are some research by design approaches, but at the end of the day, design is not research. This makes us fall between 2 worlds, between the exact sciences world and between the non-exact sciences world. You will find across the whole world many universities that identify their architecture departments or planning and urbanism or landscape departments as engineering, and others will define them as social sciences or human sciences. And it's in this sense it's very important to look at that. Even you will find other establishments that will define architecture from the fine arts point of view, which will make it more on the side of philosophy, art, and theory. However, to do scientific research, you have to be understanding the complexity of architecture, that it is overlapping with different domains. And in order to be able to do research in architecture, you have to distinguish those different domains and make sure where are you going to work. Are you going to work with historians, theoretical researchers, philosophers who are approaching architecture from this angle? Are you going to work with engineers or exact sciences so that you do measurement, testing, experimentation, simulation? Or are you going to approach it from a human side or from a social sciences side, where you do statistics, surveys, interviews, focus group? For sure, some of people do mixed approaches, but it's very important to have a standpoint from the beginning and to be aware that it's very tricky in architecture, because we are falling actually between 3 major domains of knowledge, and sometimes it's difficult for us to do and pursue high quality research, because still we have not a long track of doing research in architecture. Again, I would like to come back to design, that I classify as a non-research activity. However, if you do evidence-based design, it can be considered as research. And if you do knowledge-based design, it can be considered as research. So in this sense, evidence-based design, if it's based on non-exact sciences or if it's based on exact sciences, it can be considered as research. But design in itself is not a research activity. Well, my advice if you are doing a research is not to approach this complex idea by trying to grab every side of it. It's very difficult to stand on this side and this side and this side in the same time, and even in the design side. Actually, we have 4 different sides, which makes it very difficult. In order to be successful during your research activity in architecture, I advise you to take a side. You can go into the engineering side, you can go into the social sciences and human sciences side, or you can go into the art and philosophy side and theory. If you want to insist to be in the design, most probably you cannot stay on the design side alone. You have either to swing to the engineering, or you have to do design while swinging to the social sciences. So this is my first advice when you do research in architecture. Take a side. If you are seeking funding, also you have to identify the pool of funding. From where is it coming? The research funding nature makes a big influence on your research. You will find that in national and international funding calls, always the calls come based on a classification. Some calls come for exact sciences, and some come for human and social sciences. Some come for art and philosophy and theory will be considered as human sciences. We never find research coming from the very rare, very few calls coming on the design side. So keep in mind that taking side, I'm not telling you to do that from a subjective point of view, it is from a pragmatic point of view. Because when you take a side, also you will seek a funding that comes from one of those pools. There is nothing called funding, when you look at funding calls all over the world, there is nothing called funding without a domain. Either you find funding domains in science and technology meaning that you will fall in this side, or you find funding domain coming in human sciences and social sciences. So therefore I'm saying you must clarify early on which research method you would like to fall under and what kind of domain you will work on, and couple that to the funding nature. Otherwise your proposal or chances to get funded will be rejected simply because you are presenting a research that is more falling under human sciences while you apply in a technology and science call. So it's very important to be aware about. Again, I repeat, take a side. Now, the second idea I would like to share with you about doing research in architecture is the non-scientific and the scientific research problem definition. Well, many architects, they are working in practice, and since design is an activity that is always related to the reality and to the professional practical world, architects tend to solve societal problem through design. However, not every societal problem can be defined as a scientific problem. In many countries across the world, we find a lot of problems related to very weak governance, management, or financing. This does not make the problem a research problem. If we know how to fix the problem, but we don't have the financial means, if we know how to fix the problem, but we don't have the management infrastructure, this means that this problem is not scientific. It just means that we don't have the management infrastructure or governance infrastructure, or we don't have the financial means. But it doesn't mean that we scientifically don't know how to fix the problem. So one of the advices I always ask my PhD students to ask them, is your research problem a real scientific problem, or is it a governance problem? And believe it or not, 80% of the cases, problems that young researchers propose who are coming from the architecture or landscape or urban planning section, they come up with ideas that can be considered as governance problems. Going into a city and finding a lot of waste means that there is a governance issue. It has nothing to do with a scientific issue, because scientifically it can be fixed, and we have solutions for that through waste management research. So first thing you have to do when you are identifying your research problem, to go through this filter. Ask yourself, is it a governance problem or not? Is it a management or a financing problem? If it is, then get out, this research is for the government. It is not for the scientific community. Then you have to ask yourself the next question. If your research is not a management or a financing problem, is it a sustainable development problem? Somebody comes and tells me we need to build up a new school in a rural area in a poor country. Well, building the school in itself, is it a scientific problem? It's not a scientific problem. Designing and building a school is not a scientific problem. Well, maybe it's a sustainable development issue. Maybe an NGO can do it. Okay, well, then you get out of the scientific world. And finally, you have to ask yourself, is the research question a design problem? If it's a design problem, I advise you to go to a design firm that can solve it. How to design a neighborhood, how to design a specific building with some requirements. But this means that this filter, if your idea fails to go through it, it will end up not being a research problem. So it's very important to make sure that you have a scientific problem, to ask yourself those three questions. Is it a governance problem that can fix it? Is it a sustainable development issue that can fix the problem? Is it a design issue, a design activity can fix the problem? And if it's yes, this means that your research is not scientific. So it's very difficult to define a scientific research when you are in a context of poor governance, lack of financing, problems of low quality design. So architecture should go more into scientific problems that are that are unknown on the international level. Well, the next issue I would like to talk about when you define your research and doing research in architecture, to join a scientific community. It's not a surprise that we as architects across the world, we are doing research. We started to do scientific research only recently. So we don't have a long tradition and long practices to do scientific research in architecture. And when I say that, I ask you to look at the journals that have journals that have an impact factor with the name architecture in the title of architecture, the title architecture in the journal title. You will almost not find any journal that has the title architecture when this journal has an impact factor. So this means that in order to improve our ability to do research and establish tradition in this domain of doing research in architecture, we need to join scientific communities that are already established and learn from them. Well, after taking side and identifying where is your research area, is it in the exact sciences or the non-exact sciences, you have to identify journals and conferences in your domain area. And those conferences and journals should be high reputation journals and activities. When it comes to journals, I advise you to look to the presentation on how to select a journal, for publication, where I identify what is a high quality journal, what is a scientific journal. I mean here mainly Scopus, listed, and Thomson Reuters impact factor journals. Same goes for conferences. Conferences must be listed and must have a peer reviewing process to make sure that they are on the level of scientific research. So the first thing I advise you to identify those journals and conferences and try to read and get connected to them. Another important is to when sticking to scientific community, scientific journals, scientific conferences, and scientific research groups are possibly easily to reach through social media. So you can do that and look at their presence on LinkedIn and their annual activities, because they will give relevance and value to your research. One of the problems of research in architecture that many young researchers, when they identify a research problem, they fail to take a position or a side. They fail to classify it as human sciences or exact sciences or engineering. Plus, they fail to go through the filter of governance, sustainable development, or design. And if I do, they come up with ideas that are not relevant at all, or they don't have a value. So the only way to make sure that your research in architecture has value and is relevant is to first connect yourself to a scientific community and go through its publications and intellectual work and check what are the doubts of this scientific community, and from there you can identify your research problem based on what is discussed in the community through their proceedings and publications. So it's very important to have relevance and value in your research, and if you don't have an experience, you cannot do it. So I advise you to join a scientific community in your early career to get closer, to define more closer your domain, and to get to relevance and value for the idea that you will come up. Well, step number 4, follow a scientific methodology or approach. Here I'm talking about the way you will do the research. Now, we as architects, we tend to invent the wheel many times. We think by doing design, we have always to do new things, and research is about doing new things. Yes, research is about innovation, research is about doing new things, but research has a very strong, long, traditional, established methodologies and approaches that we can hardly cross or go over. Most probably we have to follow. So it's worth it to invest in understanding what are the common and established scientific methodologies and approaches. So when we look in general at the classification of research types, we call something called pure basic research, strategic research, and applied research. Pure basic research is more experimental and theoretical work undertaken to acquire new knowledge without looking for long-term benefits other than the advancement of knowledge. And in this sense, you will find a lot of researchers who are doing fundamental research in the area of physics or sciences in general. We are very far off from doing basic research, because most of the time we do applied research. So it is very important to distinguish those three types. Well, what is a strategical basics research? It's directed into specific broad areas in expectation of useful discoveries. Research providing the broad base of knowledge necessary for the solution for recognized practical problem. It can be about human behavior, it can be about human perception, it can be about building physics and understanding of specific chemical or physical in general phenomena. And this can be a good opportunity for us to do basic strategic research. There are chances to do that if we come up with concepts, models, methods, frameworks, prototypes, and systems. Finally, the applied research aims to acquire new knowledge with a specific application in view to determine the possible uses for the findings of basic research. So this is more application of what is there coming from the basic research activity, and to determine new methods or ways of achieving some specific and predetermined objectives. Here we are talking about developing a tool, a solution, a product, a software, guidelines, and so on. So when you start to do a research, you have to distinguish those three types of research: the fundamental research or the pure basic research, the strategical basic research, and finally the applied research. We as architects, most of the time, we are falling between applied research and fundamental research. Between strategical basic research and applied research. The strategic basic research is more difficult to do, and it requires more serious research methods, while the applied is more on the application level. So again, check your funding and check the domain knowledge of your peers and the journal that you would like to publish at which level it is publishing. Otherwise you will have difficulty to go through. Well, this is a very interesting diagram. You can find this diagram through the link that will be provided at the end of the presentation. This is an open access Dropbox link where we can download this graph. And in this graph, the work of Robert Johnson, he simply grouped the different research methodologies in architecture and defined the way they are done. So you have theoretical research in architecture, interpretative research in architecture, experimental research, survey research, simulation research, qualitative research, and even action research. And action research is most of the time the research related to people who would like to do design while they are doing their research. So this is a very interesting table because it identifies the ontological assumptions for each research approach and research methodology. It identifies the epistemological assumptions, the research goals, the methodological orientation, the variables, the control, comparison, and validation, how you do data collection, how you do data analysis, how you validate the work, and it provides even architectural examples. So I advise you, if you are looking to identify your research approach, start by looking at this graph and try to define a specific and clear approach. For sure, We can have mixed methods, so you can use different methods and combine them to do a specific research, but I advise that early career researchers avoid mixed methods because still they don't know how to master mono or single research methods. So take the time first to master one research methodology and repeat it and produce and become productive, and then later on you can mix exact science methodology with a human science methodology, for example. Well, one of the most important criteria that you must respect when you develop your research approach or research methodology, that you follow those 4 steps. Those 4 steps are crucial. Here it is data collection. Sorry for this graph, I mean data collection, data processing, instrument development, and data validation or instrument validation. Those are the 4 steps that should be respected. I repeat, data collection, data processing, instrument development, application, and validation. Those are the 4 steps of any research approach. Well, also you have to define your research outcomes early on, as early as possible, and I advise you to check and ask yourself what are you going to produce. So while you are developing your research proposal or idea or concept, what I'm going to develop: an instrument, a policy, a benchmark, a methodology, a function, a tool, a guide, a model, a prototype, and so on. It's very important to define it clear as possible and share it with your supervisor, share it with your peers, and make sure that you can validate the value and relevance of the outcome that is expected to come up out of your research. Here you have to ask also yourself, how does your methodology achieve your outcome? Does your methodology that we explained here earlier correspond to your outcome or not? And how it can strengthen the outcome of your research. Number 6, when you want to do research in architecture, reading. You must read as much as possible, but you should be very selective. When I say reading, you should read similar journal papers, meaning that publications that are published in the same area where you want to explore, and those publications must be published in high quality journals. Use the keywords of your potential research and search for similar researches and start to download them, print them, and read them to check what is similar here, what was the methodology used, how is this research serious, to start to stimulate your own research development process. Also, if you are doing a PhD, I advise you to read or skim at least 5 to 10 similar works. If it's a thesis, master thesis, it will be a pity to do a master thesis and thinking that you are the first one who will do it on earth. Most of the time there are similar thesis topics or methodologies you can learn from. So it's worth it to check first similar thesis, dissertations, or journal papers to make sure that when you will start your work, you are already following an established methodology or approach, and you just have a different topic while approaching your work. As a conclusion, we have to be honest with ourselves. The architectural culture has not had a robust tradition around research, which means that much of the research that is done in academia and practice rarely get tested, generalized, and shared. We follow ad hoc-ish research methodologies. We follow subjective, non-validated approaches in most of the cases, and therefore it's very dangerous to continue in this path. And it's not a surprise that we do not have journals, high-quality journals, that are catering architectural research specifically. Most of the research is more on the level of buildings, engineering, or social sciences and human sciences. So, if we look in medicine, for example, it is unethical for a doctor not to see and monitor patients post-surgery, and yet rarely do architects revisit and monitor the performance of buildings and conduct post-occupancy evaluation of them. And when I talk about building, it's the same for a neighborhood, it's the same for a city, it's the same for a landscape, planning for a park, for other objects that we get engaged with. So it's very important that we try to learn from other fields that are more advanced, that have similar practices of intervention, but in the same time have a well-established tradition, and this should become standard practice written into our contracts, so that we include in our research always a step of validation, testing, checking, data collection, data processing, instrument development, application and validation. By that, I would like to remind you about the 6 recommendations I presented earlier. I advise you to go through this presentation, take your time, try to reflect the content of the ideas that were presented in this presentation in relation to your research, to make sure that you will have a high scientific quality research in architecture or in the built environment related to urban planning or related to landscape design. Finally, I advise you to look at the video writing a research proposal and the video research ideas assessment. Also subscribe to the channel if you are interested to get the latest feedback on new videos. And there is a table that was presented in this presentation. You can find it by following this link. It's an open access table. You can benefit from it, and I hope you can benefit from the presentation and do better research in architecture. Thank you for your attention.